So Acts chapter 9, verse 1, we see Saul here. It says, Now Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked for letters from him to the synagogues at Damascus. Now this Damascus, at the time, was one of the oldest cities in the ancient world at this time when Saul was alive. And of course Damascus is still an active city today. It's one of the oldest cities in the world today. It's in modern-day Syria. And the location of it would be roughly about 150 miles northeast of Jerusalem. But he asked for letters from him to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, both men and women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Now this is the first of a number of references where the church or Christians are referred to as the way. Teis hadu is the way it appears in the Greek. But this is the first reference to the church here referred to as the way. And when you have the definite article, it makes it specific, doesn't it? In other words, it's not a reference to a way, right? It's a reference to what? The way. And so it was a very specific designation. And of course, one can think back to Matthew chapter 7, for example, where the Lord uses the term there. In Matthew chapter 7, verse 14, well, actually in verse 13, he starts off, he says, Enter through the narrow gate. He says, For the gate is wide and the way is broad that leads to destruction, and there are many who enter through it. And then he says in verse 14, For the gate is small and the way is narrow that leads to life, and there are few who find it. And so Christ is both the gate, Christ is also the way, and he makes it very clear that he says that there are few who find it. I remember getting into a discussion once with a gentleman who, I don't know where he got the idea, but he was under the impression that somehow as history progressed, as the gospel advanced around the world, that somehow the majority of the human race would somehow positively turn to Christ and everybody would eventually believe. And I don't know, he was just sort of under this naive optimism that the world would get better and the majority of people would turn to Christ, and there would be sort of this big church thing. And I was talking to him about Matthew 7:14, and I said, look, the teaching of Scripture is that narrow is the way that leads to life, and few are they who find it, is more the teaching of Scripture. Yes, ma'am?
Robert Jeffress made a point to this, and he said that there won't be a lot of people in heaven, according to this.
Well, yeah, but when you're looking at the whole of the human race, even right now, when we think about the number of people on the planet, what's it up to now? About 7 billion or something. Oh, she said that the pastor, Dr. Jeffries, made the comment that he referenced this verse, and that he said that there wouldn't be a lot of people in heaven. But I think it'll definitely be in the millions, maybe even tens of millions. Who knows? Maybe even 100 million. It's hard to know. It's hard to quantify because we don't have a record, of how many people believe. We just don't know. But when comparatively, if we think of how many people are on the planet even now, it's 7 billion. Even if you want to go with 1%, you're still talking about a large volume of people. So it's hard to put it into any kind of concrete number. But it definitely, I think, will be a minority that will turn to Christ. Definitely not a majority. And then, of course, in John 14:6, Jesus said, what? I am the way, the truth, and the life. I remember getting into a discussion once with somebody. We were talking about interpretation and how the plain sense of the text is really quite simple to understand. There's some difficult passages. I'll give you that. There are some passages that are difficult to understand. We can quibble over that. But really, by and large, the bulk of the Bible, we're talking 95%, is really pretty straightforward. It's really just a plain reading of the text. It pretty much says what it says. And when you're looking at passages like John 14:6, and Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no man comes to the Father but by me, and I come to somebody and I say, look, Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father but by him, and you just say, well, that's your interpretation, that's kind of weak, because just a plain reading of the text, it says what it says. And so here, even in their day, when it says that Saul goes out and he begins to attack any of those belonging to the way, even they understood that this was a very narrow group of people who held to Christ as exclusively being the way. So this was a very clear designation here. Both men and women, it says, that he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. So he has a very clear intention.